Welcome to Geezer Talks Climate. This video is about greenhouse gas emissions. Where do they come from? Where are they emitted from? What are their sources? And from where in the world do they come from? And just recall that we emit about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gas per year globally. And this just shows the evolution of those emissions and how rapidly they've grown over the last 100 years. The main contributors are gas, oil, and coal. And coal really is the worst. We need to do everything that we can to reduce and eliminate coal-fired plants. Now, there are a lot of different ways to break down the sources of emission, but I really like this one from Our World in Data just because it provides a sufficient amount of detail, but it also gives a good high-level view of really what the sources are. And I know we often think that, the main sources are coming from auto emissions just because that's kind of what we see every day, or a lot of us do, but there are a lot of other sources that we need to be thinking about and considering when it comes to reducing the overall amount of the emission. Now, there are things like cement and petrochemical and steel industry. Just turning the crank of these industries takes a lot of energy, and cement itself generates carbon dioxide just from the nature of the cement process. So there's these basic manufacturing processes like those that emit fossil fuels, emit greenhouse gases. Then there are the other areas like forestry and agriculture, and that gets to be things like burning fields in developing countries, burning fields to get them ready for the next year's planting or to clear the way for palm orchards or whatever the reason for burning, or just clearing land and converting it to cattle grazing and other farming that basically takes down trees and rainforests. But where I really want to focus the discussion is on that big red segment just titled energy. And as you can see, that's almost 75%, 3/4 of the total emissions that we're facing. And what I want to zero in just for purposes of discussion is transportation. So we think about cars and trucks. That's something, again, I mentioned that we deal with every day. And then there's also shipping and aircraft. And so if we look at this overall chart as, where can we attack this in the vein of solving the problem of emissions, it turns out transportation is one that we readily have and know the solution for. We have electric vehicles, we have hybrid electric vehicles, and those are really good options for chunking away at that energy consumption by gas-powered vehicles and the resultant emissions. So if you think about aircraft, there really aren't any near-term viable solutions for aircraft. I mean, there are some small sort of hovercraft ideas where they're using battery-powered aircraft, and these would be for obviously short hops and not very many people, but for large aircraft that we're used to, there really isn't a near-term solution. The same kind of goes for shipping. The tankers and cargo ships that are out there, they burn a lot of fuel and generate a lot of greenhouse gas emission, but today there aren't readily available technologies. I mean, there is at least one ship I read about that's burning ammonia gas, but that's probably not economically and physically viable for the mainstream. So we really have to focus on this transportation area, the cars and trucks, and I have a whole another video on just that and how we can move forward and make significant progress in reducing emissions just by changing our buying behavior when it comes to vehicles. Let's take a look now at where emissions are coming from in the world. You can see the red and orange bars there, China and the US. Now this is just total emissions. If you do this on a per capita basis, since China has a vastly larger population than the US on a per capita basis, they're pretty close to the same. And in fact, I think the US is probably greater, but nonetheless, the developed countries, China, the US, the European Union, and others, those are the ones that are emitting the most on a per capita basis and just on a per country basis. But I would call your attention to the bar that's the EU, and I think the EU does a really good job of implementing policy for the reduction of emissions. I mean, the governments are very actively involved with industry, and I mean, of course, that's not ubiquitously true, but I think in general, compared to like the US and China, I think they do an overall better job. And we can all learn a little bit from some of the countries there to see what they're doing, how they're implementing some of these solutions. Now, the elephant in the room is that big blue purple bar, which is the rest of the world. And that's, that's mostly developing countries. And there's so many of the countries in that category that don't have the infrastructure that we have in the US and China and developed countries. A lot of the people there don't have electricity and don't have vehicles, and so they live in many cases at or below the poverty level. But these developing countries are just that. They're developing, and they're starting to build infrastructure, and some of that infrastructure is contributing to new emissions. So as a global community, we've got to recognize that developing countries have the right to develop just like we have and we are doing, but they're going to create some new emissions. And so that has to be mitigated and offset by looking at this from a global perspective, where the developed countries are developing technology like electric vehicles and solar panels and wind energy and nuclear energy. Those things can be exported to the developing countries and implemented. So there's economic opportunity in some of this balancing that has to go on. But the critical point is that the balancing has to happen, because if only China solves the problem, or if only the US solves the problem, or if we only solve the problem in one of the emission sectors like transportation, we still don't win. We have to solve the emission problem broadly and globally in order to make headway and reduce the total number of emissions that we have. Okay, well, thanks for tuning in. Check out the rest of my playlist on Geezer Talks Climate, and thank you for supporting. Cheers.